Good morning. We're learning Yudalid on the Bais. Today we're supposed to learn Tesvav. We're holding Yudalid on the Bais. We made a contrast in the Mishnah between if there was a mum before you were makdish the karban, or if the mum came after you were makdish the karban. That was the big deal in the Mishnah, and it makes a huge difference in the different halachas. One of the halachas was that if you were the mum came first, the defect in the animal came first, and then you were makdish it. So, if you take this animal outside the temple and you slaughter it, you're pater. It's not a karban, it had a mum. Even if you didn't redeem it yet. Because it's not a karban. It's not supposed to be shechted in the temple.
This is just a mum kavua, isn't it?
It's a mum kavua, right?
Yes.
Okay. So the Gemara says over here, Hasheichtan b'chutz patir. It's 8-9 lines from the top of the page on the Dalet. Hasheichtan b'chutz patir. Rabbi Lazar masni chayev. Rabbi Lazar has a different Mishnah. His Mishnah, it says that if you shecht it outside the temple, you're chayev. Well, it's not a karban. It's not supposed to be shechted in the temple. So how could he say that you're chayev? Well, the question is chayev for what? It's chayev not because you shechted a karban outside the temple. It's chayev because you shechted outside the temple something that has a mum. Now, outside the temple, you're allowed to shecht something that has a mum. So umukila bebamas yachad. He's talking about that you shechted it outside the temple, and it was the time in between Mishkan and temple when over there you were allowed to have a private altar. And Rabbi Lazar has this very interesting halacha that on a private altar you're not allowed to slaughter something that has a mum, even though you're allowed to slaughter on a private altar during specific periods of time.
We were allowed.
We were allowed at certain times. Not when we had a temple, and not when we had the big Mishkan. But in times when we didn't have that, in the intermediate times we were allowed to slaughter on private altars. Rabbi Lazar says that if you slaughter a sacrifice on a private altar that has a mum, then you're chayev. Because it has a mum.
He's holding that the private altar is taking the place. It's like the Daled Amos, of the Beis Hamikdash, and therefore the same halacha applies. Right. You can't go out. It's not outside, but it is our Beis Hamikdash at that moment.
Yeah, it's a little bit less than that, but it's
certainly a little less.
But it will have the halachas of you can't bring a sacrifice that has a mum on those altars. The Amar Rabbi Lazar, because Rabbi Lazar says, "Minayin lezevech behema balas mum bebamas yachid." From where do we know that someone that slaughters an animal that has a defect on a bamas yachid? A bama is a platform, like a bima, right? It's like a stage. So the bama is this bamas yachid is a private platform, a private altar. How do you know that that's a violation of a negative prohibition? Shenemar, it says in the pasuk, "L'tzizbach l'Hashem alekecha sharvaseh." You shall not slaughter to Hashem your God an ox or a sheep, and the pasuk continues, that has a blemish. Now, if that pasuk isn't necessary for the main altar, because I have a whole section in the end of Leviticus and end of Vayikra, end of the book of Vayikra, that tells me all the halachas of a mum. You can't bring a karban with a defect. Then I have it repeated in Dvarim. So I already have it in Vayikra. It says with the halachas there. So what's this repetition telling me? So Taneyuin L'Bamas Yachid, the repetition of it is teaching me that laws on a private altar that I can't have a defect in the animals there. Ema, the Gemara asks a question. Okay, we've sort of satisfied this other version of the Mishnah, how it fits. It's not talking about that you're not allowed to slaughter it outside the temple. You are allowed to slaughter it outside the temple. It's during that special time. And we're explaining the source for where we know that there's a prohibition to have a blemish on one of those offerings. The Gemara asks, but who says that? But that's what we're going to learn the repetition of the psukim for. Maybe it's necessary. Those psukim in Dvarim that talk about that you shall not offer a sacrifice to God that has a mum, maybe that's coming to tell me the halacha by a bechar. Bechar is the firstborn animal, a kosher animal. We just learned in the Mishnah that even if the animal is born with a mum, it's sanctified and it's given to the Kohen even though it has a mum. So likarav namik shu bal mum. I could have thought that you also offer it when it's a bal mum. It's a special halacha. A bechar is different than all other karbanos. Even though the mum preceded its sanctity, it still has the sanctity. Kamash malan deloy. The pasuk is telling me no. So I need these psukim not to tell me bamas yachid. I need it to tell me bechar. Amri bechar behedik sivbei. It says no. By a bechar it already says pisei chayiv. Eily says becheno. It says clearly that if it's limping or blind, you can't bring it. We have psukim already that tell me you can't bring a bechar that's a mum as a sacrifice. You don't need these. Okay, so maybe it's telling me meiser because we learned already in the Mishnah that meiser does get sanctified, even though it has a mum that preceded its designation. Because in the pen, when you had all the animals there, you didn't separate the ones with a mum before you counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And that could have fallen on the mum one. And nevertheless, it gets sanctified. So I could have thought that if it gets sanctified with a mum, I'm also going to bring it with a mum. Which that's not so. But why is that not so? Because of that repetition in the psukim. So how can you tell me that the repetition in the psukim that tells me you can't bring a sacrifice with a mum is coming to tell me that a bamas yachid, if you have a private altar, that you don't bring a sacrifice with a mum? Maybe it's telling me meiser. Sal kadait chamina could have entered my mind. That's an abbreviation here. The sal kadait chamina, right? Could have entered my mind. Sal kadaitach could have entered your mind to say that since hayal v'kadosh b'mumei, since it's sanctified with its blemish, t'ksiv le'yavaker bein tov l'ra, that you don't distinguish between good and bad. Nikarav ubein ra'alatay. Nikarav nami b'mumei, that you should also offer it with a blemish. Kamash malan deloy. The pasuk, the repetition in Devarim tells me that you don't do that. It's Rei. Amri, the Gemara says, Meiser nami gamar havar avarmi b'char. No, we know Meiser already. We have a special word that's by Meiser. That word is by Bechar also. That's a verbal analogy. It's a Gzeira Shava. We learn that the same halachas of Bechar apply to Meiser. I don't need a pasuk to teach me by Meiser that you can't bring a karban with a mum. That we know already. So therefore, the extra pasuk is telling me again, bamas yachid, you don't bring a mum. Eima tenei when l'tmuras kachim. Here's an interesting one. When it comes to Tamura, the pasuk says that you can't exchange a sacrifice for another animal. And when it's describing that, it says whether it's a good animal or a bad animal. So that means, and if you do exchange, they both become sanctified. That means that even if the second animal is a blemished animal, it becomes sanctified. So I could have thought that when it comes to Tamura, the animal becomes sanctified even though it had prior to its sanctification already had a blemish. I could have thought that maybe that Tamura is also offered on the altar. I need a pasuk in Dvarim, in Sefer Dvarim, to tell me that you don't bring that. So the Sal Kadai Techamina, I could have entered your mind to say Hayal Kedusha Kshibalas Mum, because it's sanctified when it's. Thank you.
He's back.
Because it's sanctified when it has a blemish, so you can't exchange it. So I could have thought, I offer it also when it has a blemish. Kamash Malandalai, the pasuk tells me that no. In other words, we keep asking, maybe the pasuk is not teaching me Bamas Yachid, that you can't bring on a private altar. You can't bring on a private altar an animal, a sacrifice with a blemish. Maybe it's not teaching me that. Maybe it's teaching me something else. What's the other thing? Tumuras Kachim. The Gemara says, Amakrava Hayahu Tumurasai. It can't be that. Because it says, it and the exchange are both sanctified. Makish Tumurasai Lai. When it says it and its exchange are both sanctified, there's a comparison that it's done there. Mahu Balmum Lai after Tumurasai Balmum Lai. That just like the original animal, you can't bring with a blemish. So too, the exchange you don't bring with a blemish. Maskifla Rab Zeir asks, taking us back to yesterday's Gemara. Maybe it's telling me about the offspring of a sacrifice. The Salka Dait Chamina, Hayol Kedoshim Kshem Bali Mumin, Agaviman, Kshehim Bali Mumin Amikrevi. Let's say the mother is a sacrifice, and it gives birth to an animal. We said that the animal, if the mother wasn't redeemed, we said that the offspring is also sanctified. We said if the mother has a mum, that was our discussion yesterday. The mother has a mum, so the offspring comes from a sanctity of the mother. It doesn't get stronger than the mother, right? So here, but nevertheless, the offspring does have a sanctity. Now let's say the offspring had a mum. You could have thought that just like the offspring has a sanctity, even though the mum was there already from before it was born. So I could have thought that you also bring it on the altar, and I need an extra pasuk to tell me that you don't bring it on the altar, and then I lose the pasuk for Bamas Yachid. Kamash Malandalai, the pasuk tells me that no. It's a question. How do we know Bamas Yachid? The pasuk may be teaching me something else, maybe teaching Vladis Kachim that it's not offering. So Amarava, Rava says, Kvar Paskatana de Rabbi Shmuel. We already have a brisa from the house of Rabbi Shmuel. The Tana, the Bei Rabbi Shmuel was taught in the house of Rabbi Shmuel, Rak Kachecha Shayil Lecha Nedarecha. This pasuk, that only your sacrifices that you have and your vows are they need to be brought to the temple. Rak Kachecha is telling me Eilo Atmures. That's referring to the animals that are exchanged for other animals, sacrifices. Asher Yulacha, that are to you, that's coming to include Elo Avladis, the offspring. Unidarecha, in your vows, Hikishan Akasav Leneder. The Torah compares them to the vow. Ma Neder Bal Mum, just like when you take a vow to bring a sacrifice, you can't bring a Bal Mum. Afani Nami Bal Mum, also here also. The Tmuris and the Vladis cannot be a Balmum. So I already have a pasuk that tells me that the Vladis can't be a Balmum, so it leaves extra the pasuk in Dvarim that you don't bring a Balmum. That's coming to tell me Rabbi Elazar's din that even a private altar you can't have a Balmum. So far so good. Okay. It was all one point. It just gave it 6 shots, and then it wasn't 6. It was a Bechar, it was Meiser, it was Tmura, and it was Vladis. Gave it 4 shots. Okay. Okay. Now it says Veinais and Tmura, that this animal that had a blemish before you sanctified it, so it does become sanctified to a certain extent because you need to redeem it, but it doesn't become a sacrifice. So these animals cannot be exchanged for other animals to become a sacrifice. The laws of Tumura. Tumura is, I say, that this animal should be instead of that animal sacrifice, and they both become sacrifices because of that. So that doesn't happen to this if Kadam Muman Lehekdeshan, if the mum came first. My timer, what's the reason? The Amakra Layachlifena V'Layamer. Pasuk says you can't exchange it. The complete pasuk is Layachlifena V'Layamer. I say Tayv Barai Rabbi Tayv. Correct?
I'll tell you 1 second. It's V'lo yachlifena v'lo yamer so tov bara ora b'tov im hamir yamer behema b'behema Yahu usmorasol yeh kodesh.
Okay, so that double expression here, you can't exchange it. Rabbi
Good for bad, or bad for good.
bad for good for bad or bad for good. The way the Gemara is understanding this is that good for bad means that I would be exchanging. I have a good animal. I have a bad animal here. That means I have a carbon that has a mum in it, and I can't exchange it for a good carbon, a carbon without a mum. The Gemara asks, Hashta Rabbatay Amrit, if you have a animal with a mum, a sacrifice animal with a mum, and it's prohibited to exchange it for an animal that doesn't have a mum, you're not allowed to do that. So type Rami Bai. I can't exchange a good animal, a good sacrifice without a mum. It has to tell me that you can't exchange it for a mundane animal that has a mum, that I can't degrade it. It doesn't need to tell me that. If I can't improve it, because I'm not allowed to do the exchange, for sure I'm not allowed to degrade it. If I can't exchange, if the carbon had a mum, I'm not allowed to exchange it for one without a mum. For sure, if the carbon didn't have a mum, I can't exchange it for a mundane animal with a mum. So the Gemara learns it a little different. The Gemara takes the full phrase that toiv bara, a ra b'toiv. The Gemara is telling me that this halacha only applies to toiv bara, an animal that started off. Toiv means sanctified, and ra means that it got a mum. It needs to have been sanctified prior to its receiving a mum. But if it's ra b'toiv, but if it's an animal that started off with a mum, and then it becomes sanctified, so then these halachas don't apply. In other words, so that extra discussion it's telling me, in other words, instead of toiv bara describing two separate animals, it's describing one animal. It's describing the animal of the sacrifice. That it needs to be a toiv bara, an animal that first was sanctified and then it gets the mum. It can't be an animal that originally had the mum and then gets sanctified. That such an animal does not make tmura. Follow? No, that's what I'm learning from that repetition from that toiv bara. You can't exchange a good animal for a bad animal because that's so not necessary to say. You already said you can't exchange a bad animal for a good animal. So for sure you can't exchange a good one for a bad one. So it's coming to tell me that the animal itself needs to be toiv bara, that it started off kachim and then it gets its mum. Over there, the tmura, the laws of tmura will be applied, not if it had a mum first. That's what we see. That's what the Mishnah is saying, and the source is what we just learned here. In Mesu Yiftu, if the animal dies, it's still allowed to be redeemed. What do you redeem it for? Oh, you're going to feed it to the dogs. It's a dead animal, but the dogs can eat it. So there's two parts over here. One point is that you can redeem a sanctified animal to feed it to dogs, and the other part is.
What about for a goat animal?
Yeah, or to a guy. The other part is that you don't need to have it standing up to do its redemption. The special halachas of hamada v'haracha, that when you redeem an animal, you have to stand it up and evaluate it. And here, because it's dead, you can't do that. So, the following Gemara was very complicated for me. It took me about 2 hours to. However, I can simplify it now. But there's 3 opinions. However, the third opinion has 2 opinions, how it works. So that was the complication. I'll just read it to you from the other Gemara in Tmura to make it easier. Gimel, Bais. See, over here, there's a Mishnah that has a first opinion, and then it has Reb Shimon's opinion. First opinion, it says the Chachamim of Reb Shimon. That's what it's called in our Gemara. The Mishnah in Tmura says that whether it's kachi mizbeach, that means whether it's sanctified to be an offering, whether it's kachi bedek habayis, whether it's sanctified just as a gift to the temple upkeep. So you can't change it from one sanctity to another sanctity. And if it dies, it gets buried. It cannot be redeemed. Comes along Reb Shimon and says, kachi bedek habayis, if it was only sanctified for temple upkeep, if it dies, it could be redeemed. That means that the laws of Hamada v'Haracha, of needing it to stand up in order to get its redemption, don't apply to the kachi bedek habayis, to the temple upkeep. There's going to be a machlekes, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. What does the first opinion hold? Now remember, the first opinion started off whether this, whether that. If it dies, it needs to be buried. So Reish Lakish, though, looks at Reb Shimon and says, kachi bedek habayis, if it dies, you can redeem it. What does the first opinion hold? Exactly the opposite. The kachi bedek habayis, if it dies, needs to be buried. Kachi mizbeach, if it dies, you could redeem it. In other words, the laws of Hamada v'Haracha don't apply at all to kachi mizbeach, according to Reish Lakish. This is Reish Lakish in the Rabbanon of Reb Shimon. So Reb Shimon is very clear. We know his opinion. In the Rabbanon of Reb Shimon, I have two ways of reading. It starts off whether this, whether that, but that maybe is only the beginning of the Mishnah. The end of the Mishnah, I see that Reb Shimon is only talking about one. Is he arguing on the Rabbanon 100%, or did the Rabbanon hold both? Simply reading, the Rabbanon hold both. That's Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. Now, we also have another opinion here. We have Reb Shimon, we have the Rabbanon of Reb Shimon, two opinions in what the Rabbanon of Reb Shimon hold. Then we also have another Chachamim, which we're going to say is the opinion of Levi. So it goes like this. In Mesu, if this animal dies, the Mishnah says, Yifter, you redeem it. What happened here? I have an animal. Is this animal kachi mizbeach, or is this animal kachi bedek habayis? It had a mum. So it's somewhere in the middle. You sanctified it for the mizbeach. It just didn't work because it had a mum. So it absorbs the sanctity of bedek habayis.
Automatically, it just drops down.
It drops down a level to bedek habayis.
You can't have a mora between two.
So I'm not exchanging an animal here one for another. What happened is that the animal had a mum. I tried to impose on it to consecrate it as a karban, but because it has a mum, it doesn't make it into that status. And what does it have? The status of bedek habayis, where you just redeem it and the money is sanctified.
This is according to everybody.
Yeah, that's what happens.
Everybody agrees it doesn't get dushas mizbeach.
Right. That's the first half of the Mishnah. The second half of the Mishnah was the opposite, where you sanctify it gets the mum later. The only thing is, there's one point here that the Mishnah concludes this, and if it dies, you can redeem it. Now that is not, everyone agrees, that is a big machlekes. What's going to happen here?
Does the person who is giving the animal get a different schus, depending on when it ends up, or is the schus the same, or does not even apply? You know what I'm saying? I mean, you're smiling, but I'm not sure if you know what I'm saying.
Yes, but I know I understand what you're saying, but I don't know the answer.
Okay.
And I wasn't looking at it from that perspective. It's just like, when a milk spoon goes into a meat pot,
Sorry.
I was looking at it like very dry.
The first Rashi in the Mishnah says, "Shahel lehem mum kavua v'ikdishon limacher v'lahavi midabeim korban lemizbeach." So why does it say it's kedushas aguf?
No, kedushas damim.
Why?
Because
that doesn't mean kedushas damim. Kedushas damim is bedek habayis.
Yeah. Oh,
Here
so here you're right.
Korban lemizbeach.
You're right. It's not mamish bedek habayis. It has all the halachas of bedek habayis. Because it's mutter begiz of avodah, you're allowed to work it, and you're allowed to. It has all the halachas of bedek habayis. But what you do with the money is you buy another karban. So it's not. You're right. It's not just a general bedek habayis that is going to use to redo the temple floor.
You can't use it for the...
Right. But this animal itself has that status of the Bedek HaBayis. Okay.
Wait, I thought this is an animal that died. He may.
Now, what happened to this
After.
animal? It died.
So he's saying then you could work it.
No. I'm
First
saying...
it was alive. Later on, a little bit down the road.
Oh.
And what happens when it
while you
dies?
were waiting to do the Mizbeach,
Whatever.
you were working
In
it
the meantime, yeah.
Before we...
Sold
Yes. Right.
before. Because
Okay.
certainly not after.
I guess the sale took some time to auctions.
So, Amar Rav Yudah Marav. Rav Yudah says in the name of Rav, Zu Divrei Rav Shimon. Who's the opinion that holds that you're allowed to redeem a dead animal without standing it up and evaluating it? You don't need Hamad Varach. It's Rav Shimon. Damar Kachim Mizbeach Hayu B'chlal Hamad Varach. He says only animals that were designated as sacrifices have to be stood up. Kachi Bedek HaBayis Lo Hayu B'chlal Hamad Varach. But if it was just designated for temple upkeep, it does not need to be stood up, and therefore, if it's dead, you're allowed to redeem it. Ditnan was taught in the Mishnah. Reb Shimon, I'm a Kachi Bedek HaBayis and Mesu Yiftu. Reb Shimon says, Kachi Bedek HaBayis, if they die, you can redeem it. Umayda Reb Shimon, and Reb Shimon would agree. But Balmumi Karai goes under that category. Our case, that if it originally had a blemish, it would go under the category of Bedek HaBayis and Shenifta. My timer. What's the reason? The Amakra Isa. The pasuk says, it. And Isa lemuti balmum mikara. What's the pasuk there? It's talking about when you evaluate it. Does it quote the pasuk?
You shall stand in.
You shall stand it, I guess.
Yeah,
So it's coming to exclude. When it says it means only specifically that. It means it's an excluding something else. What is it excluding? Balmum mikara. That if it had a blemish before it was sanctified, then you don't need to stand it up to evaluate it. Aval chachamim, oimrim, but the sages say, now this is not the chachamim of Reb Shimon. This is a different chachamim. The sages say, imesu yikbru, that if it dies, you have to bury it. You cannot redeem it. Man chachamim, and who are the sages? Tana de Levi. It's the house of Levi. The Tana de Levi. Taught in the house of Levi, everything has to be stood up before it's redeemed. Levi said, it was taught in the yeshiva of Levi b'masnisei in a brisa. Afilu chaya, afilu oif. Even a wild animal, which is totally not eligible to be a sacrifice. But if you can't stand it up to evaluate it, you can't redeem it. It means if it dies, so Levi holds even Bedek HaBayis cannot be redeemed. It just has to be buried. Special halacha. Aiva ksiv Isa, but it says it, and that's an exclusion. Levi kasha. You're right. That's a question. We don't know what Levi's going to do with that exclusion, but nevertheless, that's his opinion.
they say everything, but then they say the word it, so it's an exclusion.
Right. Aval Rabbanan the Pligel the Reb Shimon, but the rabbis that argue with Reb Shimon back in that Mishnah, what do they hold? Hachinami de Mesu Yiftu. What do they hold? What would they hold about this sacrifice? This was designated as a sacrifice. It just didn't make it because it had a blemish. Do they hold that if it dies, you redeem it as well? Ihachi, if that's true, which means that they would agree with Reb Shimon in this way. So why does Rav Yehuda Marav say that this is the opinion of Reb Shimon? He should have said Zu divrei Reb Shimon and Machlokasei. This is the opinion of Reb Shimon and those that argue with him as well, because they both agree. Mibayle, it should have said. So Amri, the yeshiva answers that Rav Reb Shimon ben Lakish. Rav holds like Rish Lakish. What does Rish Lakish say? We explain that there's a machlekes what the Rabbanan over there hold between Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yechanan. Rish Lakish says that the Rabbanan hold exactly the opposite of Reb Shimon. The Amar le Rabbanan kachi bedek habayis haya b'chlal amad v'aracha, kachi mizbeach lo haya b'chlal amad v'aracha. Rish Lakish holds that only bedek habayis needs to be stood up. Kachi mizbeach does not have to be stood up at all. and therefore, this animal is considered kachim mizbeach. You tried to make it kachim mizbeach, so therefore you won't be able to redeem it, and that would be the explanation of Rabbi Yehuda Marav that says that our Mishnah is the opinion of Reb Shimon only.
That would make sense. I mean, why do you have to evaluate something you're given for a korban? It's either a seh or a keves or whatever the required.
Well, I don't really understand what the logic is in the decree of the Torah that you have to stand it up. So I don't know how to. Maybe it has to do with respect. That the way you evaluate it is a respectful way. That you have to stand it up.
Stand up and walk, then it has a lot less value. So when it's sitting down, it looks like a healthy cow. It looks like a healthy sheep.
But what I'm saying is, all these requirements where you have to bring a certain type of korban, it just names the animal. It doesn't say the value of the, right? That's in giving bedek habayis. I understand the value. Hey, how much you helping for the maintenance costs? This and that. But here, you're going to burn the thing anyway.
No, here we're talking about where you're not going to be able to actually offer it because it got a blemish.
Oh, specifically that. So
otherwise you can't redeem it anyway because it's designated. So now that it has a blemish and you can't bring it. So now there's a halacha that says that it needs to be stood up when it's being evaluated.
So if the Mishnah would have wanted to teach us this step, going back where he says, if the Gemara wanted to give us the chiddush that because it's mumi kara, it doesn't have to be hamada v'aracha, according to Shimon. Why do you have to say imesu? It could already say mechaim also. Mechaim also it could be nifta because it has its bal mumi kara. It would be a much bigger chiddush.
No, but a bal.
He says over here, my time, I know. So if you're going to be mechadesh, that a bal mumi kara doesn't need, even though it was koche mizbeach, you want to be mechadesh. Doesn't need hamada v'aracha. Why did he say imesu yivdu? Even mechaim yivdu.
But mechaim, I do hamada v'aracha. Maybe
you don't need it. The whole chiddush here is the amakra oisa lemeute bal mumi kara.
Right.
So according to this thing, bal mumi kara doesn't need hamada v'aracha mechaim for sure.
Right.
Mechaim, it would be a much bigger chiddush. Then why does the Mishnah say imesu yivdu? It should have said mechaim even the yivdu.
You have to even without hamada v'aracha.
Yeah.
It should say even without hamada v'aracha. No, it's clear that it says that you have to be paid. Now it didn't